Right now, everyone watching is probably watching from our homes. I am too, I'm in my room, and everyone here is isolated. But just because we're isolated doesn't mean we shouldn't drop the things that matter, the conversations that matter with the people that push us forward. I'm Ben Bradbury, and I'm joined by my friend on the other side of the world, Tom Worcester. And today we're going to have a conversation about the context web. Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Ben. Thanks for asking. As we enter this period of forced introspection, I think we're in the third week of quarantine now. It's definitely been a fun time to not only think about some of the new procedures and processes that we want to put into place, but also to revisit some of the things we've really built ourselves around in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and let's go in a little bit deeper on that in terms of the things that we want to revisit. One of these ideas that we've both come back to in our friendship is this idea of the context web. And the way that we learn, the way that we process the world around us differs from person to person. We have different contexts. So some people will learn through the things they have, the objects they pick up. I have this pen, for example. I know that it contains ink, which turns into words on a page, which can fuel the ideas behind people's conversations. Similarly, those ideas can be put in one of these, a book. And when I see the learnings and the words on the page, those will spark ideas themselves. And other people still might learn through the people that they speak to. But the crucial thing here is that these are different kinds of contexts. They build different webs. But the webs aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They can also layer on top of one another.
Absolutely. And when we consider that these webs are a visualization of our internal learning and understanding of the world, it makes it easier to break apart those layers. So the things you learn from your own experiences, perhaps, whether that's from your mistakes or your failures, is very different than what you might learn in academia via, written word or a textbook, which is also very different than your own experimentation. And so as you take all of these different forms of context from all of these different ways of ingesting new information, you layer them on top of each other in the context web in a way that helps you to understand a more broad picture of the things you might face in the world at large.
So let's think about how that might play out. Let's say I'm going for a job interview. There's a couple of things that are coming up. I know I'm going to have to face a decision maker at the company. I know I'm going to have to do research with them as well. And when I step in the building, I have already read several articles and books on the company and their culture. So that's one piece of context. I've also looked up the person who's interviewing me on LinkedIn. I've watched some of their videos. I've read some of their articles. So I have context on how they think as well. So I'm balancing the IQ knowledge that I have of the company with some EQ as well, being able to empathetically connect with that person. And then further still, I might have given Tom a call the night before, said, I'm going for this job, what do you think? Tom's given me some information, and now I have a context from a friend and trusted advisor. So as Tom said, all these layers kind of stick on top of each other, and what we really want to be thinking about is how can we mesh these webs most effectively so that when we need them, they snap together and give us the insight that we're looking for.
Absolutely. And when we think about the context web, it is also a metric for the accumulation of knowledge that you've had up to that point. So at any point in time, the context web that you have is a direct reflection of your ability to solve problems, to empathetically relate to others, and to tackle things that previously seemed impossible. At the end of the day, the context web is applied knowledge that you've learned over time that you can direct at any problem or any challenge to kind of come up with a new innovative solution, if innovation is a requirement.
But one of the key parts here is to not limit the information that we get. The wrong application of the context web is thinking that you have all the answers. Sometimes lightning strikes most beautifully in the unexpected places. And by not limiting our inputs, by having a wide variety of conversations, books, new ideas that are coming into the flywheel of our brains every week, we can make sure that we're staying sharp and the context that we need and we have can be applied in those areas when we need it most.
A question for you, Ben. As we think about that application, what type of knowledge within the context web do you think is the hardest to shift once you've realized that there's a new piece of information that proves that the old thing was not necessarily true? What's the hardest to replace?
That's a great question. I think we can look at a principle called the Lindy Effect for an instinct of what this answer might be. The Lindy Effect states that the longer a book or a piece of work has been around, that is the equivalent lifespan that it is going to potentially have. So if a book has come out 10 years ago, the Lindy Effect gives it a lifespan of 10 further years. Likewise, if a book was written 3,000 years ago in ancient Greece, it's probably got a longer lifespan than the book that came out in 2010. And if we think about the question you've just asked, Tom, of which kind of context is longest to shift, I think it's the context with the longest personal Lindy effect in our own lives. So the principles that have been drilled into us as young children, that we really hold as sacred, that define parts of our identity, they're going to be much harder to shift than something that I picked up in my 20s a couple of years ago. They've become part of my identity, and I've seen so much of my experiences and my self-worth derived from them. I think they're probably going to be some of the hardest ideas to shift over the long run.
Absolutely. I mean, think about gaining your political values as a young kid from your conservative parents, or think about coming from a war-torn country where you're used to a level of chaos where you hear a flashbang in the street. It's actually just the backfiring of a car, and how do you kind of get over that learned behavior? I think it's a really good point that the amount of time spent is reflective of almost like a learning investment. The more time you believe something, the more you kind of have a sunk cost of defending that thing, because you've anchored parts of your personality on that specific thing. So in the spirit of the Lindy Effect, where we are attached to our longest held beliefs or learnings, what are some of the ways that we can spot rigid thinking and replace that rigid thinking with more pliable and flexible new learning?
It is always hardest to read your label when you're on the inside of the jar. And that's because everyone watching this video is player one in the center of their own unique universes, holding the controller that dictates their fate. I'm the same, Tom's the same, and that's why we need others to question our ideals. Now, a pretty good rule that we can come back to here comes from Nobel Prize winning scientists. They recommend that every 7 years they change their field of expertise. Specifically, this is Claude Shannon, the founder of information theory. He realized that if a scientist continues doing their work for over a decade, it is probably going to result in stagnating work. They're not going to be able to be at their best. And so if we extrapolate that principle for ourselves, it means at least every 7 years, we should be focusing, or rather changing our area of focus on where we apply our time, our energy, and attention. But let's be practical here. We don't have to wait until 2027 to question these assumptions. One of the best ways we can do this is by running the ideas and the stories that we're telling ourselves past our friends. So I think you're going to be amazed by the amount of time that there's a difference between the story you have in your head and the story that someone else is telling about you. And so the way that you can have this come up in conversation is when someone has this for their own beliefs and they say something, you can say back to them, well, that's funny, Ben, because the story I'm telling myself is this, or what I'm hearing is this. And by doing that, you're not stating objective fact, you're stating your interpretation of the fact. And by starting to do that for others, you can start recognizing that own fallibility in yourself. Same question for you, Tom. I'd love to flip this around. If you're trying to spot stagnant thinking in your own context web, which needs some pruning, what would be some of the first areas you would start digging into to really find and assess those biases?
Well, I mean, I think you kind of already nailed it with one of the things you mentioned, which is understanding that at any point in time, what you have is not knowledge, but you have your frame of perspective, and knowledge is playing within that sandbox. So the second you think about, hey, Alexander the Great was the king of Macedonia and conquered the world, like you are, like that may be held as true, but it is something that you are interpreting within your frame of perspective. And so your other biases and your other aspirations and the other things you want may color your reading of this fact. So the second that you recognize that knowledge in general and learning in general is always colored by the perspective that you hold, taking a step back and saying, okay, I know that this is a part of my perspective right now, but if I take a step back from that and you detach yourself emotionally, it helps to give you a more level playing field with which to think, is this true? And do I have as true an understanding of this thing as I'd like?
I think that's well said. So let's sum this up for everyone watching today. What are some of the characteristics of the context web that matter? Well, the first is that everyone learns differently. My context web will look different to Tom's, which will look different to yours. And as Peter Drucker says in The Effective Executive, we should all make strength productive. So however we learn, however we get our context, we want to double down on that, because the more concrete your context, the more real your vision can become. Secondly, the context web is fallible. Just because we have the information now doesn't mean it's quote unquote right. And as Tom says, we want to be regularly testing those rigid assumptions and spot any potential breaks in our thinking. Tom, what are some of the key points on the context web that you're going to leave our viewers with today?
Number one, know your golden channels. So for me, the way I learn best is through other people and their stories, their analogies. It's simply the best way I take information. But number two, it's also a reminder that the context web must be diverse in order to be stable. One of the things that can be a flaw of only learning via one channel is that every learning means has fatal flaws attached to it. If I learn from other people, a bias that I might pick up is that other people may not have the right information, or they may be giving me a subconscious view of their version of events, and I might get a bias there, which is why it's important to control for how you build your context web with other channels such as reading, literature, and intentionally consuming areas so what you know is the collection of information, not one source equals one realization.